This is your joint committee of Airport and Finance and Governance for Thursday, August 10th. My name is Scott Wagner, Chair of the Finance Committee and facilitating this meeting today. To my right,
I am Jolie Justice from the 4th District. I chair the Airport Committee, and I'm a member of the Finance Committee.
I'm Bruno Mars, waiting to see Sly James do those moves. Jermaine Reed, 3rd District City Council member.
I'm not falling on a grenade for you.
Catch ya.
Grenade for you.
I got
Sly James, Mayor.
and so the Uptown Funk is over on this side. I can't wait to
Not
hear
quite. It's
what's
not quite
happening
over.
on my left.
The music hasn't even started.
Kevin McManus, 6th District.
Dan Fowler, Vice Chair of Airport Committee, 2nd District, and I went to bed early last night.
Lee Barnes, 5th District at large.
Always go to bed early.
Usually, yes.
Teresa Lohr, 2nd District at large.
Thank you. And will staff introduce themselves, please?
Kelly King, City Clerk's Office.
Nelson Munoz, Law Department.
Galen Buford, Law Department.
Thank you. We have 3 items on our agenda, but I'd like to go a little bit out of order, if I may, and have the clerk please call ordinance 170523.
170523, calling an election to be held on November 7, 2017, to submit to the qualified voters of the city the question of whether to authorize the construction of a new passenger terminal at the Kansas City International Airport, KCI, and the demolition of the existing KCI terminals as necessary without creating any general obligation indebtedness or requiring a tax increase, directing the city clerk to notify the responsible election authorities of the election no later than August 29, 2017, and recognizing this ordinance as having an accelerated effective date.
Thank you, and I understand that we will have a committee substitute for us to consider this morning, but if I may, before we get into it, we had some questions that came as a result of our last discussion a couple of weeks ago, and this seems like as good a vehicle as any in which to have that discussion. One of them dealt with terminal financing options and the question of public versus private. I might invite, if I may, our Director of Finance, Randy Landis, who has a report for us that goes through many of those questions, and I think will bring some clarity once he's completed. So, Mr. Landis, please.
Mr. Mayor, co-chairs Randy Landis, City Finance Department, members of the committee. Because I don't have a life, I was sitting in an airport in Houston a couple of weeks ago, and I had a 5-hour delay, and I turned my tablet on, and I watched your committee meeting, and I noticed there were a fair amount of questions with regards to different financing structures, and the ordinances which are in your committee actually fit along a continuum, and I thought it might be helpful for you to understand when we're talking about things like airport revenue bonds or conduit bond issuers or private or semi-private financing. Maybe if you could kind of put those on a continuum and understand sort of the pluses and minuses from a financing side, and then we can talk a little bit about public-private partnerships and why they offer you other advantages that you wouldn't find in a normal public financing like you would if you issued airport revenue bonds. We'll talk a little bit about all those things. Also with me, sitting right behind me, Councilwoman Lohr had asked some questions with regards to taxable versus tax exempt, those kinds of things. We are prepared to talk about that as well. And then, of course, you have the airport finance director here, John Green. So hopefully between all of us, we'll be able to answer your questions and get you oriented as to where your ballot items fit within that sort of spectrum of options on how to actually do the financing.
Very good.
Okay, so to get you started, we've prepared a continuum. And again, as I said in the cover note that I'd sent you all when I sent this to you last night, this was prepared for us by First Southwest. First Southwest is a financial advisor to the city. We select them through an RFP process, and they help us do all the things that aren't done within the House with regards to selling municipal bonds. So they have bid and have been successfully selected as financial advisor for the city. They don't issue the bonds. They're not the underwriter. They just assist us on all the credits of the city. And right now they are assigned to the airport credit, and they help prepare this outline for you. So if you look at this, what we have titled Continuum of KCI Terminal Financing Options, I think it actually fits sort of neatly with the ordinances that you're looking at today for consideration. if you start, you can do a couple of things with this continuum that are not actually on the page. A couple of things that I have done just with a pen is to say, if you were looking at what is the left side, at least left in front of me, where it says airport revenue bond issuance, you can make this continuum also a risk continuum, a financial risk continuum. So you could write low risk on the left side of this, and you could write higher risk on the other side. So in addition to being a continuum of options, it's also a risk continuum. And then you should also embed in your head, risk gets paid, right? So whenever you're taking a financial risk, the expectation of an investor is if something's riskier, I'm going to get paid a little bit more, or even if the perception is that it's slightly riskier, I'm going to expect to get paid more interest, right? More interest on my investment, and I want the return of my principal, right? So it's a continuum of financing options, and it's also a risk continuum. Additionally, risk is measured often with credit ratings. So if you think about credit ratings, sometimes you'll go and do a finance offering, and you will stamp on it a grade, right? A higher credit rating, a better credit rating gives you lower risk, gives you lower interest rates. So on this same continuum, you could put an A1 rating on the left portion of this continuum, which would be your airport revenue bond credit rating. And then as you moved further along to the right, as risk increases, the credit ratings would likely be lesser. So if you did a conduit bond issuance, you could expect a credit rating of not A1, but maybe A2 or A3. Lower credit rating, higher risk, slightly more in interest expense when you actually would sell that financing in the market. And then as you move to private financing, there are lots of different options. You could get a private loan, you could put in your own private equity, and as you think about those kinds of things and just think logically, if you were going to put your money that you had in the bank in something, you would actually want to get a higher rate. That's what equity expectations are. If you're an equity provider or an equity investor, that's probably going to be the highest rate of return because you're going to want to because you have choices. You could go invest in an oil well or buy trout futures or whatever it is you're interested in buying, and that risk would be paid at a higher rate. Same thing with a private loan. A private loan likely, unless it's a super highly rated credit with a great revenue stream, might cause the interest rate on a private loan to be slightly higher than the public options. So as you think about this continuum and you think about your ordinances, think about low risk versus high risk, high credit rating, which is inversely correlated to risk, being on the public side versus a lower credit rating or more risk on the other side. And then you can kind of position these appropriately. So I'm going to start with the airport revenue bond issuance, and I think everybody's most familiar with that. When we talked in one of your meetings previously, we talked about where's the authority for airport revenue bonds come from. It comes from the state constitution. Cities like Kansas City can issue airport revenue bonds with a vote of the people, as you know. And once you get that vote of the people, which is a simple majority, you have what you call revenue bond authority. So you would have to say, I want X $100 million worth of revenue bond authority. The voters said yes with a simple majority. Now you have the authority to go out and issue bonds. In this case, we would issue airport revenue bonds in different series. So as you think about your project unfolding, your $1 billion project, we're probably not going to issue bonds all at one time and incur all the interest expense from day one. We'd probably issue series of bonds. If you issue series of bonds from your newly minted Airport Revenue Bond Authority, you do it under the auspices of a master bond ordinance, which this council has already approved, and which already applies to the outstanding debt of the Airport Authority. And that airport bond ordinance sets the rules. It determines when you can issue and how much coverage you have to have and what condition you need to keep your assets in, and the most important part, the revenue pledge. Where does the revenue come from? The user fees and of the airport. So again, airport revenue bonds from a statutory standpoint are to be paid solely from the airport. The airport is an enterprise of the city. It is not the city of Kansas City, Missouri general government. It is a separate business-type enterprise of the city with its own credit rating and its own source of repayment. Because this is a highly rated credit and the airport staff, particularly our airport CFO, have done such a great job, the airport credit has been improved recently since January. It is now an A1 credit, highly rated credit, good cash position, nicely positioned to go out in the market and issue debt. Because federal law, and in this case state law as well, allow a tax exemption on this kind of debt, you can actually go out and sell Kansas City, Missouri airport revenue bonds, and this is a snapshot interest rate. This is an exemplary or an example interest rate for what you could sell those bonds at right now if it was a 30-year basic issuance with 5 years of capitalized interest. So 4.4%, pretty low interest rate. It's a low risk interest rate environment, and this includes the benefit of tax exemption at both the state level and the federal level, which simply means if you're a bond purchaser, the interest on your actual investment is tax exempt when you pay your taxes. The security, again, the sole security for these bonds are airport revenues, not the taxing power of the city like when we talked with this group a lot about general obligation bonds. That's the city's credit. That's the city's taxing authority, property taxing authority. That's completely different than this particular credit. Airport revenue bonds are what bondholders look to get their principal and interest paid, period. So if you were looking at your agenda today, you could neatly put this very first option on the left under ordinance number 170439 or any variation thereof. That would be your option to choose. And again, you cannot issue airport revenue bonds if you do not have voted airport revenue bond authority. You simply don't have the authority to do so. And keep in mind, this particular debt is a legal debt as defined statutorily. It's not a promise to pay like some of the other types of debts, or it's not subject to being paid through a lease or a financing agreement, something like that. Moving to the right on your continuum, we get to what we call a conduit bond issuance. We talked a lot, I think, last week, and a number of names were thrown out. Port Authority, Industrial Development Authority of Kansas City, Industrial Development Authority of Platte County. These are discrete agencies that have been created pursuant to particular statutes, and they have particular purposes. Some of the purposes align with airport revenue bond issuance. We have used conduits in the city's past for lots of projects. We issued the Sprint Arena bonds through the IDA. We issued the KC Live bonds through IDA. We have issued hotel bonds through the LCRA. We've issued development bonds through the TIF Commission. The reason we have done that in the past is because oftentimes if a project is being undertaken, its interests align perfectly with the mission and the authority set out in the statute for that particular agency. And it's a good vehicle, or it was chosen to be a good vehicle at the time to bind a credit and to get bonds out into the market for the city for that purpose. A conduit bond issuance is allowed by state law pursuant to the particular statutes of that conduit agency. So many of them have the ability to sell revenue bonds, just like the city, through its airport system and its airport enterprise, can sell airport revenue bonds. It's not an unusual structure. Probably 2/3 of the bonds that the city has in its portfolio, not the airport, have been issued through conduit bond issuances. The conduit bond issuance has a slightly higher interest rate. There's a reason for that. Even though what we're talking about here and contemplating is that bondholders would look to airport revenue bonds for their repayment, there's another step. There's a different brand name. When you go out into the market, you're not getting a Kansas City, Missouri airport revenue bond stamp on the offering document. It's a different name. It's the Industrial Development Authority of Kansas City. It's the Port Authority. There's a slight variation on the story and the brand name, even though the underlying credit is virtually identical. We talked about risk earlier and the perception of risk. If there's a perception of risk or it's slightly different than what you expect, bondholders want to get paid even for that perception of risk. And I'll show you a diagram in a minute that shows why there is this slight perception of additional risk, because there's an additional step. It's a different brand, even though it's the same credit, and it's a slightly different looking instrument despite being effectively the same from a repayment standpoint. That particular type of financing fits very neatly under ordinance number 170523. If you look at that ordinance and the sub that's being submitted, you can do that particular kind of financing, the conduit bond issuance, under that particular ordinance. And I think it's sort of interesting to look at the rates right now. And again, we'll talk about taxable and tax exempt later as well, and that's why we have Kathy here. But you can look at the tax exempt bond rate and notice, which I think is pretty interesting, that it's really not that different than the airport revenue bond interest rate. And there's a reason for that, because the credit quality is nearly identical. And rates have, the credit spreads, which are the difference in interest rates, have been narrowing for years and have stayed narrow for quite a bit of time. So despite the fact that you have a different brand name, and despite the fact that you have to take an extra step, you still have the same basic credit, and from a marketing standpoint, you can still get a pretty competitive interest rate, not that dissimilar from what you could get from airport revenue bonds. The next version is what we have dubbed as private financing. And we sort of think this is sort of a catch-all category. Other than airport revenue bonds, this is a catch-all, and we'll show you a diagram in a minute because it kind of combines a lot of different things. But again, instead of like the conduit payment going through a council-approved ordinance that approved a financing agreement, which said, we promise to take these airport revenue bonds and give them to a conduit and pay bondholders, you're now talking about a lease obligation, likely, which isn't qualitatively, it's not really that dissimilar from what you would undertake in a financing agreement. Again, it's a promise to pay. The question is it a promise to pay who? Is it a promise to pay a conduit agency by virtue of an assignment? Is it a promise to pay a private entity who would then pay other third parties, maybe the conduit? Again, depending on the combination of applications that are used by the private entity, and we're going to see some proposals later today and look at them tomorrow, we don't really know sort of what the interest rates are going to be. We really don't know what the complete cost of capital is going to be. But again, as you're introducing risk and the perception of risk, and you go one step further on the continuum, you can assume that the interest cost is going to be a little bit higher. If equity is involved, certainly. If a private loan is involved, likely. If a conduit issuer is involved, you've already seen the differential on that. So, we've estimated, we've written both tax exempt and taxable in this column. We've said 4.75% per today's snapshot or higher. We really don't know until you see what you get from what people give to us. So hopefully that orients you. And again, and if we think about your ordinances again, and you think about the initiative petition, 170569 should fit in this sleeve, right? Because they're saying we want to allow privately arranged financing, which really could be a combination of things. So you've got ordinance number 1, airport revenue bonds, ordinance number 2, which is your sort of agnostic, which would allow you to do a variety of things, probably both conduit and private in terms of that ordinance 170523. And then I think 170569 sort of purports to do both choices 2 and 3. So hopefully that gets you along the continuum and gives you an idea where everything fits. Again, just to give you your 101, again, thinking about how it functionally works. The airport revenue bond issuance model is pretty simple. You got the airport system, you got the airport revenue bond ordinance that mandates how you can enter the market and what the financial conditions are, including debt service coverage, things like that. And bubbling out the bottom of the airport revenue bond or the airport system are net revenues that are available to pay principal and interest. In this case, they get paid to a paying agent pays bondholders. Pretty simple. Simple, straightforward, clear, clean. Perception of risk is low. There's information that's always attached to the offering statements that gives a clear explanation of the airport's finances. In this case, there's a feasibility report, all kinds of things that would go with that an investor could look at and go, oh, I get this credit. It's clean, it's clear, it's simple, it's a legal debt of the airport system, and it's solely paid by airport revenue bonds, or airport revenues, excuse me. If you look at the conduit bond issuance model again, well, now you got somebody else issuing on your behalf. That's what conduit means. They're doing it on your behalf. So you've picked a third party. You've agreed to add a little bit of complexity because you've got some additional documents. You've agreed to either pass through your revenues directly to a trustee to pay bondholders, or you send them through the conduit. We've done it both ways, in the city's history. But there is a little extra step, and there's a tiny little additional perception of risk, but it's basically the same credit. You're still using airport revenue bonds to pay, and they're either passed through or directly paid, and the bondholders expect maybe a little premium on that interest expense, but in this market, not too much. And then we have private financing, and we threw the kitchen sink in this for you just to give you an idea. On the left hand, at least my left hand version of this is, these private groups could come back to you and say, you know what, we don't really want to go borrow any money. We don't really want to put our own cash or equity in, or even any that we might raise privately. We like that conduit model. So what we like to do is design and build your airport, and we want to issue conduit debt through one of the agencies. That's a perfectly reasonable option and could be what we see. With regards to conduit agencies, again, they can issue debt either on behalf of the municipality, in this case the airport system, or they could issue it on behalf of the developer. Depending on how they do that and how many times the money changes hands, that might create a taxable issue versus tax exempt. So in this model, we've sort of given you the idea that if the airport system pays the private entity, then the private entity pays the bondholder, as opposed to assigning the airport revenue to the bondholders, that might create a tax issue. Same thing with private debt. Here we're talking about the airport system through the lease obligation, dropping it through and paying the private entity or their lender. That might create a higher interest cost as well. And then, of course, equity being the most risky form of the capital in terms of risk getting paid, you've got this equity piece that might be thrown in to either finance the early part of the design build portion, and again, they're going to expect to get a return because they have options. They don't have to build projects in Kansas City. They could go put their money anywhere in the market. So again, there's an expectation that risk would get paid at a higher rate. Some of these variations too could look like construction loan. I know Councilwoman Kennedy is not here, but she mentioned the notion of there might be a construction loan. I think most of you guys understand that pretty simply, that there might be a short-term loan, interest only, maybe it's taken out, has a balloon in it, maybe the equity gets taken out, and the whole thing goes to conduit at some point. That's another option or variation on theme. So we don't really know what these groups are going to come forward with, and again, we don't know precisely what their overall cost of capital is going to be, but you can assume, this model, because there are more steps and potentially more handoffs, and you've got taxable and tax exempt issues, probably is your most expensive form of financing, but there might be reasons to undertake it anyway. And that gets into this kind of brief discussion about public-private arrangements. So this is another continuum. It's not a financial continuum, but it gets to the question of, as you're considering these things, if you're doing a straight municipal financing and the airport goes out and hires all the consultants and they hire the general contractor and they do all the steps, that's your public option. It's the least private, right? Public builds it, public finances it. A more private option would be to have a third party, through a separately, discreetly selected process, do the design and construction, but we still finance it, either through revenue bonds or conduit debt. So you got in your continuum, you got slightly more private. You get the benefits of some of the private activity, i.e. the speed, the delivery, their relationships, things that the city simply doesn't have, given our bureaucracy and the way we approach projects. Maybe you get better delivery and a lower project cost, but you use the public model or one of the public models to do the financing, so you get the benefits of the lower interest cost. And then, of course, the most private option, as you guys know, is a complete public-private partnership that basically, we provide the revenue and they do everything else. They design it, they construct it, they finance it, and in the case of the most typical what you see or what you normally hear about for P3 type financing, they also operate it. That's not being considered in the Kansas City model. We've truncated the operations part of it out, so we're really just talking about design, construct, finance. So it just kind of orients you to least private, most private, public options. So why in the world would you do a P3? And again, so these are sort of some of the reasons why you would even consider a P3. If the private sector gets involved, they simply can do things that we can't do. We have laws in place, we have ordinances, we have procurement preferences, there are perceptions of the city, and a lot of those relate to things that we do. You think about when you get vendor bids, sometimes vendors include in their bid the fact that they perceive the city to be a slow pay. That might not be the case with a private bid. A lot of the processes that are done from the private sector can be done more on a just-in-time basis. Procurement steps may be cut out. Vendor relationships could be qualitatively different. They may have a national or international flavor to them that the city doesn't have. So there are a lot of potential benefits of looking at a P3 partner in the kind of P3 thing that we're talking about, and they relate to things related to lower overall project cost and speed of delivery. Those could be huge factors with regards to analyzing these proposals and then considering them in the context of the financing options that you have available. So a P3 can be beneficial if it has a truly lower cost and it gets you a project faster, and then again, with the same or better quality that you're looking at. Additionally, why also would people look at P3s? There are places in the country, places in the world that do not have the sort of refined capital market that we have. They don't have access to capital in the same way. So there are places other than places like Kansas City, who has a highly rated airport credit, that simply don't have access to credit. So that's another reason people do these things. I don't think that's the reason we're contemplating. We're looking for speed. We're looking for a better delivery and a lower project cost. So again, if you think, I'm sorry with analogies, but if you think about if you can get a mortgage on your house, your $300,000 house for 5%, versus getting a mortgage on the same exact house built the same exact way for $250,000 principal at 5.5%, you might look at those differently, and you might actually get a better result for the lower cost house with all the same bells, whistles, and everything with the higher cost financing. So that's why we're kind of mulling these things over and thinking about them together, because I think you have this unique opportunity. And I will tell you, as we look at these things too, we probably need to talk to the vendors and the proposers and talk about whether their financing proposals can be uncoupled, because I suspect, without knowing, and I don't know if any of you have leased a car before, but sometimes you focus on the payment, right? Because that's what you're really focused on. And you don't unbundle the lease and try and figure out everything they're doing in the lease, because you got the car you wanted and you got the payment you wanted. There's a potential that it will not be possible to uncouple these financing arrangements from these design-build contracts, because the incentive to speed and delivery and those things may be related to the profit motivation in terms of their investment as well. So if you think about these things together, I think people would say, oh, well, we'd like to get the speed and the delivery and the low cost, and we want the low financing because we think that's best. It may or may not be best when it's all bundled together. So we're going to have to look at it critically and sort of understand that it may not be as simple as just taking pieces and breaking them apart and then putting them back together the way we want them to be put together. Okay, here's some misnomers regarding P3, a few things that you should think about as well. When you think about debt capacity, we talked about debt authority. a few minutes ago, in terms of getting bonded authority. When you look at a credit like the airport credit, you also have to think about the capacity of that credit to continue to provide operations, to pay existing debt, and to also be able to fund appropriately additional or new debt. So a P3 project does not preserve debt capacity, right? You're still using effectively the same resources, and you will still have something on your balance sheet. So the fact that something will be purported to be off balance sheet won't necessarily be off credit for the airport. Rating analyst talked to John Green the next time he has his credit surveillance done, or he issues some of his remaining bond authority from his old bond authorization. This particular financing, whatever form it takes, will be considered as part of the overall liabilities of the airport system. Okay, so it doesn't really matter which choice you choose. One thing that we will note is one of the three options may have greater weight, may have greater credit weight than another, but they will all be considered as part of the overall financial wherewithal of that airport credit. And there's really no such thing as truly private financing. I know we have tried to make a ballot language we keep using the term agnostic. I think it would be not correct, and we can ask our bond counsel what she thinks as well, about putting something that says private financing in our bond language. One, because it may be viewed as a bait and switch if it's ultimately taken out with a conduit financing. And two, we don't really know that it might not be a quasi-private public financing that would be suggested. So, the airport system still has the payment risk. You're going to have a lease payment. You're going to have a financing agreement payment. You're going to pay something in these two models that are anything other than airport revenue bonds. So to call something purely private financing isn't exactly correct. I know the spirit of it is it's more private because we're not selling airport revenue bonds from voted authority, but it's not truly, and I don't think we can guarantee from either our own balance sheet or even from the ultimate structure that we'll have a private financing that uses a private loan solely or private equity solely as their vehicle to get the project completed. Again, back to your continuum, the very first one that we use. Yes, interest rates will be higher on the riskier edge of the continuum. Yes, tax-exempt financing through a highly rated entity is the most efficient form of public financing available to do public projects. No question. Our market is unique in the United States, and it works very efficiently. And if you add an equity component to one of these units, one of these particular choices, obviously, remember, risk gets paid, equity gets paid at a higher rate. The weighted average cost of capital for a combination of something like a private loan and a conduit and equity is going to be higher than an airport revenue bond. I think we keep telling you that over and over, but just want to make certain that it sinks in. And again, as you look at a private-public partnership, cost of capital is not the only thing that you're looking at. You're looking at speed, you're looking at the other delivery advantages of a P3, and I think that's why you've undertaken this process and undertaken this RFP review. So hopefully that helps orient you to ordinances 1, 2, 3. I think hopefully you'll know where they fit categorically. Hopefully you'll understand the risks and the rewards of the various options, and then hopefully that'll make you, or give you the opportunity to make a better informed choice as to which of the particular choices you like the best. I think you have great options before you. I think you have very good proposers that have given you responses. We look, us finance geeks, look very much forward to what we get delivered this afternoon, an opportunity to review those, and our hope is to have some solid information available to you as you undertake the review process with the qualitative review of the bids on Monday. Happy to answer any questions, and again, as we said, John Green's here if you have specific questions with regards to the airport financing, credit, those types of things. Kathy Peters is here from QTAC Rock to answer any questions with regards to tax questions, taxable, tax exempt on any of the options.
Very good. Thank you very much for the presentation. Questions? Councilwoman Lohr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Landis, let's go back to page 1 and over to the private financing, which is not really, we're not going, there's no such thing as private financing, right? That's what I'm seeing. There's no such thing as solely private financing, but we're going to look at that. Where it says tax exempt or taxable, 4.75 or higher, I'm assuming the taxable bonds would be higher. Is that right?
Yeah, if it's determined by tax council that something would have a tax related issue to it, and the whatever those bonds are, that financing is deemed to be taxable, the interest rate will be higher because investors will expect to be paid a higher interest rate because they have to offset that with the tax issue that they actually have to pay on their taxes at the end of their calendar year.
Right.
So
So I'm assuming the bondholder is looking for a profit, as will be the company we hire is looking for a profit on financing that money for us. Is that true? So we've got two people looking for a profit from that one piece, from the one piece. Is that right?
absolutely. So as we said before, investors expect to have their principal returned, and they want a return. In the case of a bondholders, it's a less risky instrument. You hope to get a reasonable return on your investment. Equity participants, it's a riskier venture to put your own money into things. They expect to be paid a higher rate.
Absolutely.
return.
So we've got two people in line to make money off of this one bond issue, the investor and the bondholder.
Two different kinds of financing, but yes,
yes.
to your point, yes.
Yeah. Okay, you said higher. Are we talking 5%? Are we talking 10%, 15%? Do we know what the rate is?
Well, I don't know that we know. Obviously, again, the tax question is going to be an important one, so that will determine a tax exempt rate, which would be lower, or taxable, depending on if you do a bond issue. And then for equity providers in this space, which I'm not an equity expert with regards to airport financing. We have several, some of whom are in the audience, who will be assisting us, including Lee Fisher, First Southwest, Emeritus, and others who will assist us as we review any equity provider portions of these bids, and we'll determine what is a reasonable return on equity for projects of this sort, if there are any that are comparable to, just like we would for any development project that we would bring to you.
So you're telling me you set the interest rate?
Now, we would determine what we think is a reasonable return based on other market-style projects of a similar nature. Of course, the entity that's bidding, that's going to propose to use equity, they will tell you what their expectation is as a return, and it's likely a negotiation from that point. We may not be willing to pay that level of return on equity for this project, given the fact that all of these financing instruments are paid from the same place, airport revenue bonds. So I would suggest likely this would be a less risky project from an equity or debt perspective than you might find for other traditional looking development proposals that plans and zoning or others would review.
Like airport revenue bonds? It would be less risky than airport revenue bonds?
Oh, I would suggest it would be less risky than a hotel project or a shopping center.
But we're not building that, we're building an airport.
Right, so I would suggest that equity providers should expect a lower return than they might expect for other choices of investments that they could make for other styled developments.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I have Councilman Fowler.
Yes, thank you. And just so I understand a couple of things, when you talk about risk, and if you would go back to, this slide number 1. I guess my question is, I think I understand this, but in the case of the public vote, it's the bondholders who would purchase airport revenue bonds. You're talking about their risk, is that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And with the conduit financing, you're talking about risk of whoever would buy those bonds, and because of that risk, they get paid in interest. Is that correct?
Yes.
Then you go to the private financing, you've really got potentially two elements. One's an equity investor, and he's going to want, or she or it's going to want more money back than a bondholder.
Likely, yes.
So they've got higher risk than...
Equity is typically the most expensive form of project financing because the perception of risk is higher because you have choices again. You can put your money in whatever. You have choices of, you don't have to build a project in Kansas City. You can invest in a hotel project in California or something.
Because whenever you buy any kind of bond, you've got some, even though I would argue in this case it's next to none, risk that whoever's issued the bonds is going to default on them.
Yes. And in this case, every one of these risk takers can look to the same exact revenue stream for repayment, and the only difference are the nuanced differences of how many additional steps, what the brand name is, you know, in the case of a conduit issuance, or whether you're breaking it into pieces in a private partnership where there might be an equity piece and a private loan and a takeout later. So you're really just kind of moving on that continuum and slightly increasing the risk, but you know, the relative risks are low across the spectrum because the airport credit is a strong credit, the airport revenue bond pledge is a strong pledge, and the perception of it in the market is very well received, and we should garner very competitive proposals regardless of the form of financing that you actually undertake.
And going back to the pure private financing, I think I know the answer to this question, but I've got to ask anyway. You're assuming an interest rate of 0.4% or more higher than on revenue bonds. I'm going to assume that that does not include an adjustment for whatever an equity.
Yeah, and that's why we wrote or higher, because we don't, again, we're just talking about, you know, just different variations on the same theme until you get to equity, and then equity is kind of a wild card. There aren't a lot of projects that are being undertaken in this style of financing with an equity injection that don't also include operation.
And final question on the conduit financing. You said, I wrote down 2/3 of all city bonds use that structure. Is that right, or did I get that 2/3?
Yeah, and again, think about how hard it was to get general obligation bond authority. You all went through that and had to. And in Missouri, you know, there's this super majority to get general obligation bond authority. So the city, for many, many years, didn't have much general obligation bond authority or really didn't seek it. So we issued a lot of bonds through conduit agencies. And our promise to pay was effectively what was, you know, the security, not unlike what we're talking about here, airport revenue bonds. So, you know, we built, you know, a lot of development projects in the arenas and all kinds of things through conduit issuances.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mayor James.
I want to clear up a couple of things. There are advantages and disadvantages to all three of these options, correct?
Yes, sir.
You're not making a recommendation as to which one?
No, sir.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you really can't make a recommendation without having reviewed the entire package, including the financials, right?
Correct.
So on the public side, on the airport revenue bond issuance, one of the disadvantages is that it could be slower.
Yes.
And by being slower, then the interest rate on that money would stretch out longer, so you might end up with a higher number than with other vehicles. Is
Yeah,
that correct?
interestingly, you know, you think about, you know, time is money, right? So, you know, the longer construction period, longer ramp-up period, the city would actually have to issue additional bonds and to actually pay the interest on those bonds. So we're actually issuing more bonds than we would have to otherwise with a shorter construction period. So you've got what they call capitalized interest that's included.
So then the public option could actually wind up being more expensive than some of the other options, correct?
It could be.
All right. Now, going to the conduit option, that's something that you say that we use all the time.
The city has used it consistently.
Right.
The airport has not. The airport has solely used airport revenue bonds in its history, at least that I'm aware of.
All right. The projected interest rates between the 4.40 airport revenue and the 4.55 on the conduit is 0.15 difference, correct?
Yes, sir.
That 0.15 difference accounts for what, $1,500 per million?
Something like that, yeah.
All right, so not a huge amount there. The effect of the conduit would be that the city, that the airport would still get the same benefit of tax-free bonds, But with that, if that were to be used, especially with the design build function, it could be much faster, therefore the price of that could actually be lower than to go straight airport bonds, correct?
Using that approach with the design build and the combination of conduit financing, that is a possible outcome.
And then on the far right, the private financing option is higher and a little riskier because you don't know exactly how all the money's going to come in. Some could be equity, some could be debt. Frankly, they could even probably use some conduit issues as part of that.
They could just
All
pick,
sorts of
they could just
combinations.
pick conduit. They could recommend conduit because it might be the most efficient in their mind as well.
Bottom line is that you're providing information, not a recommendation, and you can't provide any recommendations until you see both the, both sides of each individual package. And that the developers who submit those packages may have embedded in their proposals the reasons why they want to use certain types of financing, correct?
Yes,
All right. So the evaluation of the responses is the key to the issue.
absolutely.
Thank you. And you will be evaluating that financial aspect,
I will be part of the team,
part of the team, and John Green will be part of the team?
leads the team.
And then the airlines will have someone that's part of the team?
Yes, I had failed to mention them earlier. Advair also will have a representative as well.
And those particular people do financing for airports around the world, do they not?
Yes, and they have a keen interest in what the cost of funds would be and the cost of the project and the timeliness.
All right, thank you. That's all I have.
All right, thank you. Councilman McManus.
Just to follow up, the mayor's point, I think, was partly what I was trying to dive into, is the one aspect that you're not mentioning on this continuum, which is really helpful because I think a lot of us think about this in a binary way, that it's either or, but this shows actually three options, and it's a spectrum. But the one thing that's not mentioned on here is time. And I believe when you came to talk to us at business session, you mentioned time as a factor in cost as well as interest rate. And time is calculated not just in terms of the time that it takes to build the project, but the time it takes to hold the money.
Absolutely.
And my question is, I believe you told us in business session, I don't want to, correct me if I'm wrong, but that time to hold the money might be greater with public versus private because of a charter provision, a legal provision.
Right, right.
My question is specifically, is that time to hold the money different when it's done with a conduit lender? Is that charter provision kick in the sense that we're going to have to issue, is there a potentially higher cost? Do you see what I'm getting at? Is that issue present in that hybrid conduit model?
I don't know that we've kind of thought through that, Councilman, honestly. It could be, but it might not be. So just let me research that a little bit further.
I think that would be important once we are, the point I think was already made that we're not at the point of evaluating these proposals, but I think when that evaluation is made, I think it would be important for us to know, I guess, not just the interest cost, but obviously I would hope you'd look at the time to complete the project as well as the time to hold the money.
And as you think about this continuum, pure public, so all the charter rules and code of ordinance rules and laws that apply to the city don't, and I'll let Galen correct me, and Nelson, but as you move further along the spectrum, there's a potential that you don't have to follow all of those the same exact way to the letter of the law. There will be certain ones, MBE, WBE participation, those kinds of things that the city likes to have in its projects, but to the extent that you move further away from the purely public structure, you may not have to follow all of those the same exact way if, for instance, you did more of a private financing or a conduit. So we'll have to kind of have legal review and determine where those things fit. And then some of those things, by preference, you can say, yeah, even though it's a private structure mostly, we still want to do that because it's important to us, prevailing wage, those kinds of things that you've talked about.
Certainly. I'm just looking for, I guess, the flexibility, an understanding of the flexibility in which models and how that impacts costs.
Yeah, and John Green kicked me under the table when we talked about that charter provision, and I had just remembered it when we did the last terminal improvement that we had talked about it with one of his predecessors. So I think there may be ways to work around that using other portions of the charter to do interfund borrowing and things like that. So I think, I may have, I threw it out there just so you know and just to chum the water. But again, thank you for remembering.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councilman Lucas.
Thank you, everyone. And Mr. Landis, I want to say, first of all, thank you for sending us these documents in advance. It gave us a chance to at least get our heads prepared for your presentation, which was a clear one, and I appreciate that. Just a few questions for you. First of all, throughout this process, I've been wondering about transaction costs in connection with the different either types of financing or what we're doing regardless. Even in the float of public bonds, we retain bond counsel, we have to present it to the market. There is some sort of cost. As we explore the other areas, both conduit financing and I guess the private financing model, could you at least speak to, is there a difference in transaction costs? Yes. Is there actually less for us? Kind of just speak to that.
And I think, again, it sort of follows the continuum. And again, as you think about extra steps, additional agencies, their in-house counsel, additional legislative steps, they have to take actions if you went through a port authority or an IDA. They have some of the, particularly on the conduit, they have issuance fees. So there's something that you would add that you typically wouldn't have on the airport revenue bond issuance. So again, I think you can expect the cost of the professionals will be higher as you move along the continuum toward private financing. There are more hands, there are more legal steps, there's more documentation, there's potential issuance fees. Having said that, you still have to consider that in the context of the whole. And considering in the context of the whole, again, if you're looking at a construction fund, which is really what everybody's focused on, is what does it cost to build the thing? If the cost to build the thing is substantially or less under one of these approaches, and you can get it faster, these issuance fees and transaction fees and professional service fees are often mitigated by virtue of that change in what the total cost of ownership will be.
Mm-hmm. And then, this is kind of a new area for me. It's a completely new area, actually. So issuance fees, does that usually run as a percentage, or is that a general quantitative amount? If you use this authority, they charge you $1,000, or do they charge you 1%, 2% of some corpus?
They usually, they all have their own schedules. And I will tell you, I'm not aware of an agency in this city that's undertaken anything of this size. So I suspect there will be a negotiation with regards to any issuance fee if you use a conduit, because their fees are usually scaled to the amount of debt that's being issued, the amount of bonds that are being issued. And I would suggest this scale will require a pretty thorough review, and we're going to say, we're not going to pay you, based on your scale, $10 million to do this bond issuance. It's going to be a reasonable fee commensurate with the amount of work that's undertaken. And something I didn't mention earlier, and I think there was some confusion a little bit about conduits previously. These conduit issuers do not take on any financial risk. All right? They are purely a vehicle for issuance. So their fees are mainly to pay for their professionals, and they are not on the hook for anything. It flows through them to the bondholders, and the bondholders really look to the financing agreement payment or a lease agreement payment as the security for their principal and interest payments. The conduit issuance folks are just they're in between, they're a means to an end, they take no financial risk, they have no wherewithal if there were defaults on payments and things like that, and bondholders will, even though they will look to them, there will be an agreement running back to the airport that will be tied primarily to that lease or financing agreement obligation.
Mm-hmm. All right, well that's helpful. And so the conduit really provides professional services so that we can use them as a conduit. But that's, in essence, what the justification for the cost is. But I understand that you're saying issuance fees usually relate to something out of a negotiation / a schedule that's already created by the agency.
I was saying they will have a standard issuance fee for the entity, mm-hmm. and then there will be a cost of issuance sleeve of the total financing that will pay for underwriter, bond counsel, rating agency fees, trustee, all those kinds of things that go to put the financing team together and get the bond sold.
Understood. All right, so that's helpful. In terms of sticking with the conduit financing question, I understand the city uses it on some different types of projects. Are you familiar, or perhaps is Mr. Green familiar with whether conduit financing has been a model frequently used in airports or infrastructure projects kind of similar there too? I understand there are a few larger airport projects. I wonder if we've seen this kind of conduit financing approach.
John may be able to speak to it. I'm not an expert in the airport revenue bond issue. I mean, obviously, there's models around the country that issue through port authorities and things like that. But again, maybe John can pop up and...
I will invite Mr. Green, come on, choose any microphone you like.
Morning.
Morning.
John Green, Chief Financial Officer at the Aviation Department. Generally speaking, and I'm not as well versed as our folks at Lee Fisher on this that work throughout the country, but I would suggest that for the most part, airports do not use conduit debt, generally because general airport revenue bonds are available to them without voter referendum. That's unique to this state. So airports outside of this state would generally just use general airport revenue bonds. There would be no need to take that second step.
Understood. Helpful, thank you. And that, I guess, presents another question then as to, we're speaking about differences in costs. And I looked back over the RFQP last evening after receiving this. Time of delivery seems to be kind of where our big question is. If we can get faster delivery, you can save in cost, et cetera. But there seems to be a fundamental presumption that the private approach, be it financing, et cetera, provides faster delivery. And I guess the question I would have is, does it have to be that way? So, for example, in RFQP, we actually suggest one can come up with whatever funding stack they wish, and timing of delivery will be a consideration. I imagine if we were so inclined, we could say, we want public financing plus very fast delivery, and a proposer could respond and say, we can do that. Is it, I guess, the question in this being, is it, I guess, gospel truth that public financing always will require a slower delivery schedule?
Well, we can speak to the perceptions of public financing, right, the two of us, and I think John's called Phil up here to talk about project delivery.
Sure.
You know, I think there's a perception that public financing is slower and it's clunky. We have kind of a streamlined process in Kansas City, regardless of how we choose to actually do our financing. We can appropriate funds in advance, so we can actually have funds available, whichever model you choose, by virtue of an ordinance and using interfund borrowing to provide funds quickly. So, and that's some things that we may end up talking about on Friday as we look at the proposals, because I think there is somewhat of a perception that cities can't have money to spend until they go through a public bond issuance process and bond proceeds are delivered to a bank to spend. So from the perception of can we get financing quicker, smoother, faster, we actually think there might be some discussions, on both sides of that. With regards to project delivery, I think this is the cue for Phil now that he's up here to talk about, are there ways that the public can speed up its process that can match the private side? And maybe you can talk about some of the obstacles or lack thereof.
I'm Phil Muncy, Deputy Aviation Director, Manager of Planning and Engineering. There are many alternative methods of delivering projects available now to the city, such as design build rather than design bid build. But in this particular case, these teams are already formed and already together, and we've looked at their books. We'll see the financing this afternoon, and that's a huge jump start in this particular case. Now, from an overall perspective, they can still usually bring things quicker together. Again, the financing is independent, I think. It's just tell me how you're going to finance a project, and we can choose the delivery method to meet up with that process. But in this particular case, again, if we talk about particulars, there's an ordinance that prevents me from establishing teams, from getting the package together. This particular process has worked through that to say, here are our teams, select these teams, and they can get started right away.
Anything further?
Just,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking for a moment. Okay. That's satisfactory for us. I guess final point would be looking back through the ordinances, and I find all three choices we have to be interesting. And this may be more of a Mr. Buford question than the others, because it seems as if the ordinances, and Mr. Landis kind of put it this way, go from broadest, not as broad, narrowest, being question 170439, while contemplating public financing, doesn't require you to take the entire amount of public financing, so you can, in essence, do anything you want with it, never issue a bond, never do anything. It just permits the destruction of the terminals, in essence, plus public financing. 523 permits you to do everything but the public bond issuance, correct? And then the final one requires privately arranged in whatever way that means. And so I guess I'll just ask you to make sure my understanding is correct. 439 would permit you to use both public financing to the extent listed, but also then conduit financing, correct?
It would not, I mean, you can get voted authority, and John can have voted authority sitting on the shelf and elect not to use it.
Right. Okay. So 439 is public plus conduit plus whatever. 523 allows you, I guess, conduit, but not a float of airport revenue bonds, correct?
It would not have voted authority.
Okay. And then 569, I guess, endeavors to do what 523 does as well.
I think so. And I think that's its intent. I would let the petitioners speak for themselves, but I think that's the intent.
And do we actually, Mr. Buford, and I know we actually talked to bond counsel in connection with 523. For 569, do we have a kind of a definition of what privately arranged financing means exactly, or is that something that we would have to interpret later?
Interpret later, I think.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Councilman Barnes.
Mr. Muncy, if you would come back up real quickly.
A nice try.
You answered the question that I have, but I think you ran over it pretty quickly, and I want to go a little more in depth into it. The design build process now has somewhat eliminated some of the timing issues, would you not say?
Yes, I mean, and this one is a comprehensive design build because there's the roadways, the garage, the terminal, the apron.
So regardless of whether we do conduit airport revenue, there probably won't be much difference in a timing issue. Am I to assume that? I mean, there may be a little, but probably not enough that we're going to be the difference in the amount of interest on the bonds.
Right. I mean, there's so many different ways to put the program together. And there's one way that's on the table now, and there's many other ways available to the city to do it. The one that's on the table, I believe, is probably quicker than what a city could put a program together for.
And that's regardless of whether we do public versus private financing.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Anyone else? Councilwoman Lohr.
Yeah, I have just a couple of questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In ordinance number 170569, the verbiage in there says uses privately arranged financing. Now, we were told last week, I believe, we couldn't use the word private in there. Is the bond council decided that we can use the word private now?
Well, for the moment, just so we're clear, the only thing that we're contemplating currently is 523. So we've not read 569, so for the moment.
I apologize. Okay.
Yeah.
That has to, where does that go? To this committee?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's still contained in this committee, but as I recall, and Mr. Buford, you can correct me if I'm wrong, since this came from initiative petition, we have within 60 days to act. We are well within that 60 currently. So if we wish to take action on it, we have that time frame in which to do it.
You have 60 days from the date that the election authorities certify the petitions, the signatures. And in maybe not complete, but a partial response to your earlier question about 569, about kind of why do you see privately arranged financing in the ordinance, given what you've been told before? The Committee of Petitioners wrote this language.
So would that be corrected before it went on a ballot?
That depends upon what, our advice would be that it should be changed. This will come to the Joint Committee in the form of an ordinance, so that correction is ultimately up to first this committee, then the full council, but it would be the Law Department's advice that that change be made, that that verbiage be deleted.
Okay. Okay, I think the other thing I wanted to address was particularly when it came to there is no solely private financing. I think, you know, we've had a problem with getting this issue out there for the last several months, especially since private financing came into the picture. And I, as a council member and a representative of the people who voted me in, want to be open and honest with the public and how we're going to finance this and what we're going to do. We have been talking about privately financing this airport for months now. In fact, that's not the case. If in fact we choose to go through conduit financing, which means a private developer would use a quasi-government entity to bond out the airport project. So I think that needs to be very clear to the public, because otherwise they're going to think we're trying to trick them into doing something that they really don't want to do. I know the polling is much better if it's not publicly financed, but I think if we're open and honest with the citizens of this city, they're going to understand, they're going to know if the money is better and cheaper with public financing, then they're going to understand that. I think this smoke and mirrors game that we've been playing is getting us nowhere, and I think we need just to be open and honest on how we want to do this project, from the financing to choosing of the company that's going to build this airport and everything in between.
Thank you. Anyone else? I thank you very much for the presentation. I do note that, Ms. Peters, you are here and you've come all this way. I don't know if there's any comments that you wish to make in connection with what Mr. Landis has presented or not, but I'll give you that opportunity.
Thank you, Kathy Peters, Kutak Rock. I will say that I came from 2 Pershing Square, so I wouldn't say I've come a great distance. That's where our offices are. I would agree with everything that Mr. Landis said, and as Councilwoman Lohr noted, each one of these options, ultimately the source of repayment is revenues from the airport. And I think it's important, as you consider the ballot language, that you recognize that whichever one of these options you wish to choose after you've evaluated proposals, that you make it clear to the voters and have the ballot language not be misleading. The ultimate source of repayment will be airport revenues.
Very well, thank you. Any questions for Ms. Peters before she runs off? No? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. As mentioned as we began this discussion, there is a committee substitute, 4170523, that our co-chair, Councilwoman Justice, wanted to bring forward. So I think this would be the opportune moment to do so. So I'll turn it over to you to explain it.
Okay, thank you. And for committee members, this is the same committee substitute that was circulated 2 weeks ago. There's been no changes to that at all. This language has been vetted by our legal counsel, by our finance department, and by our bond counsel. The ballot language that I'm proposing is, and I will read it because it is short, shall the City of Kansas City be authorized to construct a new passenger terminal at Kansas City International Airport and demolish existing terminals as necessary, with all costs paid solely from the revenues derived by the city from the operation of its airports and related facilities. I'm proposing this language for 2 reasons. Number one, it meets all of the requirements that we've heard today relating to making sure that, number one, we comply with the ordinance that was passed by the previous council, giving a vote of the people on the construction and demolishing of a terminal at KCI. Number two, it specifically says where the costs are paid from. I also think that it's important that we move ballot language forward, because right now I feel like there's an unnecessary sense of urgency on the selection process because the ballot language deadline is looming. And so I would argue that we should move forward with this committee substitute and send it to the full council for consideration so that the selection process can take place in a manner that I think is reasonable and allows us the time that we need to make the best decision on behalf of the city. So with that, and I know there'll be further discussion, Mr. Chairman, I move that committee substitute for ordinance number 170523 be reported out of committee with the recommendation of due pass.
Second.
It has been moved and seconded that committee substitute for ordinance number 170523 be passed out of committee with recommendation of due pass. Is there discussion on that motion? Councilman Lucas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I do think, although I guess the conversation became only discussion of 170523, we do have a colleague on the council who proposed 170439, who just in terms of background, I believe, was the first to actually introduce some language in connection to financing and, of course, the ballot issue in relation there, too. And my understanding of these conversations, having been in the committee meetings, was that these ordinances have been discussed in concert. Given the fact that, in my view, while time is of the essence, I don't know if time this week is of the essence, I would recommend that we delay at least moving this out of committee until first our colleague may be back to add further details and discussion as to 439, its merits, issues relating to public financing, and the reasons why she proposed said ordinance, but then also so that we may be able to add some further review to the conversation. I think as our back and forth with Mr. Landis just discussed, we all understand there are no clear answers or options, but we do understand that if we pass 523, unless we also put 439 on the ballot, if we pass 523, we are eliminating one option available to us in financing the airport. And we're eliminating that option before we've actually reviewed bond proposals, or pardon me, not bond proposals, the design, build, finance proposals, and before we've actually, I think, had sufficient conversation, in some ways to the mayor's point, to know what exactly is even happening or going on. And so I would recommend that we delay this conversation until our next joint committee meeting, which I believe might even be scheduled already for next week on the 17th, or yeah, that would be next week. And so I'd recommend that we hold the 523 consideration until said point.
Very well. Any other discussion? Yes, Mayor James.
If I recall correctly, at the last meeting, Councilman Lucas, at the end, suggested that the language that we're talking about could be voted. There's been no change in the language, and there's been no change in the circumstance. So why is there a change in your position?
Councilman Lucas.
So there may be two very clear points. At that same committee meeting, the proponent of 439 was sitting right to my left. She is not here today, and I think in a simple matter of comedy to my colleagues, I might recommend that we do such a thing, given that this doesn't need to be approved today. I might make one other point, though, I think in the financing conversation, which is that I do understand that giving us a chance to actually review and think about what is possible in our financing stack is some sort of use for us. I think since that time we have some further understanding of council as to what we'll actually know about the different proposals. And so I guess I would say I don't think there's any harm to giving us a week, allowing the proponent of 439 to return, allowing us to actually have more information that informs our votes. And I don't think in any way that it would harm any of our efforts to take that amount of time, but that's just...
Please.
Let me just say, first of all, the mere fact that a council person isn't here on a subject has never stopped us from voting on that subject before. Secondly, the fact that this is not being voted by the council today, it's not being accelerated or advanced, and will be up for discussion on the 17th, that person can still weigh in and convince the council of their position at that point in time. Thirdly, by waiting till the 17th, I think that there is perhaps some incentive for those who do not want to see this project move forward to stall it out. Just saying. So there's no real reason to wait until the 17th to vote this out of committee. We could vote it out of committee now, have the discussion on the 17th when that council person that you're concerned about is here. And if there is a valid argument, then the entire council will hear it and have a chance to vote. We do that all the time. You've done it yourself, where you voted on committee on one thing and then turned around in council legislative session and voted the exact opposite way. That's certainly possible there. What we need to do is move this out of committee and get it before the entire council on the 17th so that we'll be ready to proceed on the 24th.
But before we get into other debate on that point, I want to see if there's any other salient points. Councilwoman Lohr.
Well, just as my earlier remarks, I don't want to confuse the voters any more than we've already confused them. And I don't know that this ordinance going forward is where it needs to be yet, because we are not addressing airport public revenue bonds. So I think another week would be fine to hold till we can get it more clear. Otherwise, this is just going to muddle this issue even more, and the paper's going to come at us again. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting tired of being accused of all kinds of things. So I want this clear as a bell to the voters out there, what they are voting for and what their options are. And I don't think this gets us there.
Thank you, Councilwoman Lohr. Any other discussion? I do know I'm sorry, Councilman Barnes.
In light of the fact that we've scheduled 3 joint committee meetings, voting this one or any of these 3 out today, why would we need to continue with any of the joint committee meetings?
I guess,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
So was the question if this...
So I guess my question kind of leads itself to say, in anticipation of having full dialogue and getting some results back from the financing portions of the bids, the design build portions of the bids, we anticipated being able to look at those things on the 14th and having a better sense of what may be best for the city. So why would we then move forward with an option that will eliminate the public financing piece if, at this point?
Councilwoman.
Because I don't see a burning need to move this forward this quickly. I just,
I'll let her answer that question. Go right ahead.
So first of all, I think we should keep the next 2 weeks of this joint committee meeting. Number one, Councilman Lucas brought up the fact that one of our colleagues, Councilwoman Shields, has introduced 170439, and that would give us the opportunity, if she wanted to, when she's back in town, push for that being pushed out of this committee. We would have next week to do that. I'm not asking that 523 be advanced. I'm asking that it go on to council with the regular due pass. The same thing could presumably be happening next week, where we could vote up or down 439 next week. I do believe, because I am supportive of 523, that I personally would like to get it to the full council for consideration, because time is getting short. And that's just my belief. And I understand your concerns as well.
But how can you have that belief fully when you don't know what the public financing options are going to be in terms of whether they're going to be better for the city?
And what I'm saying is if after the proposals come in today and our self-described financial geeks spend the weekend on it, and then we spend Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or however long it comes forward, if during that time it is clear that public financing through straight-up airport revenue bonds is the desire of this council, then we will be able to move that forward and we can let this other one go to the wayside. But right now, my concern is that we have a deadline for a November election looming, and I would like to see this language move forward without further delay. And that's just my belief, and I understand that we disagree on that.
And I would suggest that once a vote is taken, this debate for the moment will kind of solve itself. Is there anyone else who wishes to have discussion? Councilman Lucas?
So, I mean, same point of before. I guess a point that was made prior. I've previously proposed ordinances, as you well noted, and I recall, for example, on incentives, we had that held for roughly 3 months or more, and I'm certain I missed a council week, and I might have been disappointed if there was some action taken on it at Planning and Zoning Committee while I was just away, and so on. And so I still think out of a simple standard of comity, someone, if we're going to take some action, which in essence kind of negates their ordinance, we might give them an opportunity to be around and discuss it. One other point for those who note that on the floor, while we can do or debate what have you, although we have changed ordinances on the floor, I do find, and we talk about the committee process all the time, addressing these issues, coming to the better answers, having the opportunity to ask experts and others within the committee process is in some way helpful. Let me give one other reminder in terms of this entire process, which is the whole reason we're here. When this issue came up to us in May, the reason it was suggested to us that we actually needed to work under this time pressure was because we needed to actually know enough about the proposal, then the single proposal, and now the multiple proposals to help inform us as to ballot language. A funny thing happened on the way to the forum, and now, I guess in the last week or several, we've decided that we don't need to know anything about them and with ballot proposals, which actually in some ways makes sense. That being said, I thought the reason we came up with our timelines, we've done all the work from RFQP to everything else, was that we contemplated on August 24th we had a decision to make. I understand that is 2 weeks away, but I'm not seeing what the concern is with holding until August 17th in this committee a conversation after we're actually better informed, which then gives us sufficient time to read this language that Councilwoman Justice was kind enough to introduce several weeks ago, and that Councilwoman Shields, I believe, introduced a month and a half ago. So I'm not as concerned with our colleagues not being informed or not understanding, and so I would continue to suggest that a discussion till August 17th is sufficient. One other point, and the mayor was suggesting that there may be some who are just looking to delay. I think 170439 calls for a November election, so I believe the proponent of that ordinance is not looking to delay. 523 calls for such a thing, and so I'm not sure of anyone on the council who's actually fighting the fight of avoiding a November election, so I just don't see that being a concern.
Very well. I'm sorry, Councilman McManus, please.
I guess the way I'm looking at this, and I can be corrected, but I think 523 doesn't negate public financing as an option. It just authorizes what it says, which is construction and demolition. I think what we need, though, is if we do public financing, we would then need a separate either question or this would have to be amended in order to get that bond authority. And I guess what I'm looking for is if we want to have that discussion, I think the 17th would be an appropriate, it sounds like everybody agrees that 17th is a good time to have that discussion, but I don't know that it requires not moving on what I think everybody agrees on, which is demolition and construction needs to go to the vote of the people, regardless of how we finance it. We need a vote of the people on those two issues. So I guess the way I look at it is that's a separate question, and it doesn't necessarily require us, and I don't think it should require us to even think or look at the proposals that are being considered, because no matter how we finance it, no matter who the proposal is, we're going to need a vote on that piece per the ordinance.
Thank you, Councilman McManus. Councilman Fowler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is more a question, perhaps for Mr. Buford. We would have multiple options to amend this between now and the 17th, even between now and the 24th. Is that correct, if we pass out of committee today?
The passage of the committee sub 523 does not preclude either this committee or the full council from considering putting on the ballot the airport bond, revenue bond authority. They're separate. Yeah, they're separate questions. They can be presented to the voters separately.
Oh, okay.
So if the committee chooses to do so, they could pass out the committee sub today, and then after more information is provided to the committee, after we've seen folks who will be able to understand the financing proposals better than me, come back to you next Thursday morning, and you can consider whether you want to pass out the ordinance that would put the Airport Revenue Bond Authority before the voters.
Very good.
Thank you.
Sure. I'm sorry. Please.
Well, then, at a minimum, we know that we are going to have to vote or submit to the people a vote on ordinance number 170523 that allows us to demolish an existing terminal and build a new airport. We know that's got to happen. I'm going to support passing it out of the committee because this is one of two pieces as I view it. Let's get this part done. Then, once this is done, we can then consider what we have to do. If it turns out that the issuance of airport revenue bonds is the way we need to go, then we can either amend this and put another question or do a separate ordinance, put another question as far as that goes. So this would take care of one piece that we know is going to happen. And I think it's very clear in what it says. It tells the people that we're not going to, we're going to rely solely on airport revenue to pay for whatever happens out there. And so they will at least have that comfort. Whether we say, describe it one way or another, it's very clear that that's the only source of financing. It won't be tax dollars or general obligation dollars or tax dollars on the city. And I think that's a crucial piece that people need to and want to know at this point.
Very good. Thank you, Councilman Fowler. Councilman Reed.
I believe Councilman Fowler made the point that I was wanting to get to. I think his points are well taken. I think what we continue to hear is good. I move that we close debate and call for the question.
Before we do, I had Councilwoman Lohr, and then since we kind of jumped into it with the proposal, I do want to give a public testimony opportunity so that they have it before we have a vote. But your point is well taken. We can talk it to death. At the end of the day, a vote's a vote. It kind of tells you where you're at. So, Councilwoman Lohr, and we'll close off that discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure that everybody within hearing range knows that no one on this council wants to delay this project, and no one more than I want to see it on the ballot in November. So to say that we do is absolutely wrong. We want it on the ballot. We want a clear message to the voter as to what they're voting for, or it's going to fail. So that's what the only thing I'm speaking to today. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Councilwoman Lohr. I do not have, so we'll close off the discussion for council. I don't have any cards unless anyone's turned anything in, but I will ask if there's any public testimony for committee substitute for ordinance number 170523. Seeing none, we do have a motion and a second. So with that, Madam Clerk.
Justice?
Aye.
Wagner?
Aye.
Fowler?
Aye.
Lohr?
No.
Lucas?
No.
Barnes?
No.
McManus?
Aye.
Reed?
Aye.
James?
Aye.
6 ayes, 3 nays.
The ayes have it. Committee substitute for ordinance number 170523 will advance out of this committee with recommendation of due pass. Is there any further business? Councilman Lucas.
Because we can amend and do other things on the floor, and I think we've usurped, I guess, the committee process here, I'd move that we move forward 170439 so that the proponent of said ordinance has the opportunity to discuss it and do everything that she'd be so interested in doing. So I'll move that ordinance 170439 be reported to the full council.
Second.
With what recommendation?
What's that?
Recommendation.
Oh, with a recommendation of due pass, or actually, I'm happy to just allow her to discuss it, so I'll move that it be made with no recommendation, as we can do.
Okay. And was there a second to that motion?
Second.
There was a second. Okay, there's a motion and a second for ordinance 170439 to pass out of committee with no recommendation. Is there any discussion on that motion? Councilman Lucas.
I might just suggest for everyone who is noting the awesome powers we have during legislative session, which we do, there's almost no reason that this shouldn't be moved forward as well. It actually,
before, I apologize, I did something out of order, which I did not have the ordinance read. So please read it, if you would, please, Madam Clerk. I apologize.
170439, calling an election to be held on November 7, 2017, to submit to the qualified voters of the city the question of whether to authorize the construction of a new passenger terminal at the Kansas City International Airport and to authorize the issuance and sale of airport revenue bonds in an amount not to exceed $990 million for these aviation and aviation-related purposes, directing the city clerk to notify the responsible election authorities of the election no later than August 29, 2017, mandating and establishing a competitive bidding process for any construction, and recognizing this ordinance as having an accelerated effective date.
Thank you. Now, although I see Mr. Klein has gotten up, I'm not sure what magic was in there, but please, what did you have a comment to make?
If you're going to do a committee sub on this to move it forward with no recommendation, we have some suggested changes to the ordinance to make it 990 is the construction amount. We want to make sure that it's the right amount and the right dollar, so we've got some language that staff's worked on previously on this language.
Okay, we'll accept it.
This just can be done on the floor.
Although I
Well,
would recommend that to not belabor, because we do have a motion and a second, it would be my thought that should a motion prevail, that changes could be done as a committee substitute. But I'm sorry, or excuse me, as an amendment. However, Councilman Reed, I believe you were going to say something.
At this time.
Okay, very well. Councilman Lucas.
Yeah, I'll just note the same point. Everyone was just discussing how 523 can be modified as necessary. We learn more. Mr. Klein actually, I think, makes the same point as to how 439 can be amended, and I still consider it a principle of comedy that we at least allow this to be discussed as well. My view is that this council is not inclined to put two separate airport questions on the ballot, and so because we're likely to just have one, and because there was just one put forward and our colleague who's out of town doesn't have the opportunity to advocate for her own, then I would suggest we move this forward to the full council so that she could, and I just consider that a matter of basic respect to our colleagues. But that's all.
Very well. Any other further discussion? Will clerk call the roll on the motion to pass out ordinance 170439 with no recommendation? Committee sub. Or excuse me, committee sub has not been accepted, so it is just 439.
Justice?
No.
Wagner?
No.
Fowler?
No.
Laura? Aye. Lucas?
Aye.
Barnes?
Aye.
McManus?
Aye.
Reed?
Aye.
James?
No.
5 ayes, 4 nays.
The motion passes. All right. Anything else to come before this committee? Seeing none, we are adjourned.
Actually, if you changed it now, I would have voted aye.